The 8th of November 1944 at Hespe near Achmer, Major Walter Nowotny climbed into an M262 as ground crews worked in the wet cold under a low November sky. The turbines wound up over soaked earth and dispersed revetments, while the scramble came through for American bombers already over the Reich. He was the first Luftwaffe pilot to reach 250 victories, and now he sat in the cockpit as the public face of Germany's jet force. He launched anyway. That mattered. He had already scored 3 victories in the Me-262, and the German command had put his own name on Kommando Nowotny to prove that the new fighter could strike the bomber stream and still outrun the piston escorts hunting below it. In that moment, the aircraft, the rank, and the reputation all said the same thing. Speed still belonged to him. The field fell away. The jet climbed. And somewhere above the defense of the Reich, a man with 250 behind him was heading toward a battle that should have favored him. It did not. By the 8th of November 1944, the American answer to the Me-262 was no longer a chance encounter in open sky. The 8th Air Force had turned fighter coordination into a repeatable presence around the bomber stream and the German jet bases. Before that afternoon was over the Achmer area, Walter Nowotny would be dead, with 258 credited victories, 3 of them in the Me-262. That is the ending. The harder fact is the scale of what stood behind him when he took off. Nowotny was not just another squadron commander sent up on an emergency launch. He was a major, a national ace, and the chosen face of a weapon Germany needed to work at once. Kommando Nowotny carried his name because the Luftwaffe wanted more than results from the Me-262. It wanted proof. Proof that the jet could still cut into American bomber formations. Proof that speed could restore a margin the Reich had lost. Proof that one new aircraft could still impose terms on a sky crowded by American force. That burden sat on a very small formation. This was not a mature jet arm spread across secure airfields with time to absorb losses and refine routine. It was an emergency combat command in the middle of the defense of the Reich, operating from fields around Achmer under constant pressure, asked to fight while the system around it was still being forced into shape. The machine itself carried the promise. Twin turbines, heavy armament, a speed no piston fighter on the German side could match. From the German side of the line, the appeal was obvious. Come in fast, strike hard, and leave before the escort could settle the fight. But confidence at a headquarters is one thing. Confidence on a return route is another. By November 1944, the Americans were not simply escorting bombers to and from targets in Germany. Their fighters were also part of the air around the bases the jets had to use. That changed the meaning of every scramble. Every launch from Achmer and the nearby fields promised a chance at the bombers, but it also tied the German pilot to a fixed geography on the way home. A piston fighter could loiter in that world. A jet had to come back through it. Nowotny's presence made the stakes larger. He had already been used to embody the answer. He had 3 victories in the Me-262 already on the books, enough to make the claim look real inside the German system. If he could do it, then the jet could do it. If his command could survive long enough, then perhaps the Luftwaffe had found one hard point left in the defense of the Reich. And if he could not, the loss would be larger than one aircraft. Because what was being tested over Achmer was not only a pilot and not only a machine. It was a belief. The belief that the fastest operational fighter in the war could still choose the terms of contact. The belief that American escorts could be denied the one phase that mattered most. The belief that a commander with Nowotny's name, Nowotny's authority, and Nowotny's experience could make the jet age arrive by force of will before the enemy learned how to meet it. The Americans had already learned enough. That is why the final count matters at the beginning. He did not die as an unfinished experiment. He died as the first pilot to 250 victories, and he died after adding 3 more in the Me-262, at the very point where the Luftwaffe needed those victories to mean that the new fighter still held an answer. On the German side, the pressure was immediate and practical. Bombers had to be intercepted. Fields had to remain usable. The unit had to launch from wet ground, climb, strike, and recover while enemy fighters were still in the air above northwestern Germany. In those conditions, every sortie asked more than courage. It asked timing, fuel, clear approach paths, and luck against an enemy that was no longer arriving as scattered individuals. The unit still went up. It had to. From the field and the staff, the feeling was simple enough. The jet was fast, the commander was proven, and the emergency could still be met in the air. Then the figure answered that faith. He entered the afternoon with 258 credited victories. The route back to Achmer had to pass through the same sky. While that confidence still held on the ground, the mission was already moving. American bombers were over Germany. The scramble from Hessepe near Achmer was not ceremonial, and it was not staged for propaganda. It was a working launch into the defense of the Reich, made under the pressure that had come to define late 1944 for German air units. Wet field, low cloud, dispersed revetments. Men hurrying around a machine that promised speed but demanded a clean return to be useful again. Around Nowotny, the world of the unit kept turning in practical steps. Ground crews had to send the aircraft out. The command had to commit one of the few names in the Luftwaffe that still carried weight by itself. The field organization had to trust that the jet could get into the fight and then come back through airspace that no longer belonged to Germany in any full sense. None of that looked dramatic from the revetment. It looked routine. That was the danger. Because routine was exactly what the American side was beginning to erase. Not with one lucky sighting, and not with one pilot stumbling onto history, but with enough order in the air to make a German recovery corridor part of the battle. The Me-262 still offered what Germany desperately needed in the attack itself. It could rush a bomber formation, fire, and break away with a speed advantage. Yet every advantage in the past had to be cashed in somewhere, and that somewhere was the journey home. So the atmosphere around Achmer carried two truths at once. The jet remained formidable. The unit flying it was already exposed. That split defined the afternoon. For the Germans, the sortie still began in the old language of interception. Get airborne, reach the stream, attack the bombers, use speed as armor. It was a language built for moments when the Luftwaffe could still separate the strike from the withdrawal. By the 8th of November, 1944, those phases were colliding. The bomber battle no longer ended when the firing pass ended. It followed the German pilot back toward the field. Nowotny represented that contradiction in one cockpit. He was the ace chosen to legitimize the jet in combat, and he was also a commander forced to use it before a stable operating world existed around it. The field near Achmer was not just a place of departure. It was part of the fight. The approach lanes mattered. The timing of return mattered. The altitude at which a pilot came back mattered. A machine built to dominate in speed could still be made vulnerable if the sky over home was waiting for it. The Germans did not need a lecture to feel that pressure. They could hear it in every urgent launch and every recovery that no longer looked clean. The men around the aircraft knew what the mission required. Strike the bombers if the chance came. Bring the jet back, if it could be brought back. Keep the experiment alive one more afternoon. And Nowotny still went out, as if that margin remained his to command. From his side, there was no alternative worth the rank he carried or the role assigned to him. A named command could not stay on the ground while American bombers crossed the Reich. It had to rise and answer. From the German side, the instinct was to trust the machine one more time. The jet would reach the battle first. The jet would leave it fastest. The jet would still turn speed into survival. Then the war answered in figures. He had already scored 3 victories in the Me-262. By the end of that same date, the 8th of November 1944, the man sent up to prove the jet would force everyone to look backward instead. That choice had been made long before the mud at Achmer, the 19th of October, 1943. East Prussia. Walter Nowotny stood at the point where personal score became state property. He was Austrian-born, already a leading fighter name in Jagdgeschwader 54, and on that date, he received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, after becoming the first Luftwaffe pilot to reach that threshold. The figure mattered inside Germany, for one reason, above all. It came from a front where the Luftwaffe had once fought with room to maneuver, broad sectors, and the initiative to choose when to strike. His legend had been built there. Of his final tally, 255 victories had come on the Eastern Front. They had come in 442 combat missions, spread across a war of distance, low-level pursuit, sudden attack, and repeated chances to turn experience into more experience. In that air war, Jagdgeschwader 54 gave him the conditions a hunter needed. Space, repetition, tactical freedom. The habits formed in that world would travel with him even after the world itself had disappeared. What made his name dangerous was not only the count, it was the method. He belonged to a Luftwaffe tradition that treated altitude, surprise, and speed in the attack as a single act. Find the vulnerable point. Dive through it with a short firing window. Break away before the fight became a turning contest. Against Soviet aircraft over the east, that doctrine had rewarded nerve and timing. Against bomber formations later, the same instinct still made sense from the German side. Strike once, strike hard. Leave before the enemy could settle behind you. That was why his removal from frontline flying mattered. After the 19th of October, 1943, propaganda value and military value became entangled. A pilot who had crossed that line was no longer just another Staffel leader or Gruppenkommandeur to be risked and replaced. He was a public asset. His name carried proof that the fighter arms still produced masters, even as the Reich's strategic position worsened. When he returned to operations, he would not return as a private man. He would return as a verdict already printed in advance. That return came with the Me-262. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe needed more than a machine. It needed a face that could make the machine believable. Kommando Nowotny was built around that need. The formation itself was an improvised combat bridge, not a settled jet force with long-tested routine. Yet by putting his name on it, the German command fused pilot and aircraft into one claim. If Walter Nowotny could make the jet work in the defense of the Reich, then the jet could still reopen a margin Germany had lost. The doctrine matched the image. The Me-262 carried heavy armament and a speed advantage no German piston fighter could claim. From the German side, the intended rhythm was brutally simple. Scramble from the field, climb into the bomber stream, make a fast pass, fire at close range, and withdraw before escort fighters could force a prolonged engagement. It was the old fighter ace's attack compressed into a new machine. Not elegance, efficiency. The men around him were part of that reputation. Kommando Nowotny did not orbit a relic brought out for ceremony. It was expected to fight at once, under his name, in the hardest airspace Germany still contested. The staff backing him treated the unit as an operational test under combat pressure. The pilots looked at the record he brought from Jagdgeschwader 54 and saw authority that did not need explanation. The command looked at the same record and saw legitimacy for the jet. So when he came back carrying two histories at once. One was 255 victories from the east. The other was the burden of making a new aircraft mean something over Germany. On his side, the logic sounded clean. Let him loose in the fastest fighter they had, and the old result would appear in a new form. One of his own side could still say it without embarrassment. Put him into the jet and let him hit first. Then the count that justified the faith stood there by itself. 442 combat missions. The 2nd of October, 1944. Hessepe. The return to combat did not begin in failure, it began in proof. Kommando Nowotny was operating from the fields around Achmer, still raw, still improvised, and still expected to meet heavy bombers over northwestern Germany. In that first phase, the old German reading of the Me-262 seemed to hold. A fast jet, handled by experienced fighter pilots, could still cut into the bomber stream and get out again. That mattered because Nowotny himself produced visible results. Before the final week came, he had already added jet victories to a record built in piston fighters. On the German side, that looked like confirmation, not hope. The commander chosen to legitimize the aircraft was doing exactly what he had been sent back to do. The machine reached the bombers, the guns hit hard. The pass ended before the escorts could turn the encounter into the kind of fight they wanted. The method still looked valid in action. The Me-262 did not need to circle with heavy bombers or duel at length with escorts to make its case. It only needed short windows: climb, strike, and break away. For a Luftwaffe command desperate for an answer in the defense of the Reich, each successful pass argued that speed had restored at least one piece of lost initiative. Not command of the air. Something smaller. The ability to impose a moment. This hardened confidence inside the German chain of command. Adolf Galland backed jet interception as an emergency answer for the Reich defense because there were still flashes in which the arithmetic favored it. A handful of aircraft could threaten a formation that had once required far larger numbers to penetrate. Every time a jet got in, fired, and came back, the case for continued use grew stronger. The unit remained small. The claim around it grew larger. Yet the proof contained its own blind spot. The same qualities that made the Me-262 formidable in the attack tied it to a stricter routine on the ground and in the air. The jet could slash through the stream. It still had to launch from a known field, gather itself after takeoff, return on fuel, and descend toward a fixed runway. Meanwhile, the Americans were ranging deeper over Germany and staying in the same sky longer than the old German timing had allowed for. From the German seat, that first looked like pressure around the edges, not a change in the center. So the old reading survived one mission at a time. If the bomber stream could still be reached, the aircraft still worked. If victories could still be scored, the warning signs could be filed away as operating friction. Pilots accepted hurried scrambles. Ground crews accepted disrupted rhythms. Staff officers accepted that a new weapon in late 1944 would have rough edges. Success in the attack kept overpowering what was building around the recovery. That is why the danger did not announce itself as defeat. It arrived dressed as partial success. The German pilot still saw bombers ahead of him and a speed advantage under his hand. The field still launched him. The command still counted results. All of that looked like vindication. It even sounded that way on his side. Gallen could back the jet because it was still drawing blood. Then the confidence settled on a figure too small to satisfy the promise made for it. Keep sending them. He has already shown what the aircraft can do. The number was 3. The 11th of October, 1944. Northwest Germany. The arithmetic stopped closing cleanly. A jet could break into a bomber formation, claim a success, and still come home through thicker escort presence than the sort he had begun with. The old German count measured the attack. It did not balance the route back. The figures now sat beside each other without agreeing. 3 victories had been scored in the Me-262. One recovery corridor had become a repeated point of exposure. That mismatch altered behavior before it altered belief. The launch was no longer the whole mission. Takeoff, assembly, return, and landing began to matter as much as the firing pass itself, because those phases were tied to known fields and known timing. Over the Reich, speed still won a moment in front of the bombers. It did not clear the sky over the way home. A pilot on that side could say it in plain terms. The hit is not the problem now. Getting back through the circuit is. One landing pattern. The 3rd of November, 1944. Berlin. Adolf Gallen reacted inside the emergency logic of the Reich defense, not with surrender, but with endorsement. He continued backing jet interception as a live answer, which meant the Me-262 effort would stay in the fight instead of being withdrawn to wait for safer conditions that did not exist. The consequence was countable and immediate. One jet formation remained committed to combat around the Achmer fields under pressure that had not been solved. That decision mattered because it kept the experiment exposed. The jet was not being preserved as a future weapon. It was being spent in the present tense. A command already carrying Nowotny's name would keep launching into airspace where attack and recovery could no longer be separated with confidence. Gallen's posture from the German side was still practical. Use what still works. Keep it flying. One command stayed operational. The 5th of November, 1944, Achmer. The second reaction came at the field itself. Kommando Nowotny continued to be used as an improvised operational bridge rather than a mature force, and the consequence could be counted in geography. The unit had to operate from fields around Achmer while every return narrowed onto a finite set of approaches. That turned one local circuit into part of the wider bomber battle. No one on that side needed a theory to understand the danger. They only needed to watch the routine compress. Scramble, climb, attack, turn back, descend, recover. Each step still belonged to German intention. The timing around those steps increasingly did not. At the field, the conclusion came out in a sentence stripped of pride. We can still send him up. Bringing him back is the harder part. The number attached to that truth was one runway. The commander of the named jet unit was still flying into battle with a method that worked at the point of contact, and returning through a sky that no longer respected the old sequence. The 7th of October, 1944. High over central Germany, the German side met a change it could count. American escort fighters did not merely glimpse jets that day. They brought down Me-262s in air combat and turned a technical problem into an operational result. For Kommando Nowotny in the fields around Achmer, that took away the first thing a new force needs, surprise. A jet could still arrive fast. It could no longer assume that speed alone would prevent escort fighters from arranging the meeting. The loss was immediate and practical. German launch plans now had to account for Americans above the bomber stream and still present after the firing pass. Two phases of the sortie had become one danger zone. In the days that followed, the reaction stayed procedural. Dispersal continued. Emergency scramble patterns continued. But each of those measures cut into something else. Dispersal protected aircraft on the ground, yet it slowed concentration in the air. Emergency launches put machines up quickly, yet they sent pilots climbing in smaller packets and at less favorable altitudes. The Germans kept trying to preserve the striking pass and paid for it with weaker assembly. A unit built to attack in speed was surrendering the freedom to mass where it chose. The subtraction did not need drama. It lived in the order of departure, in the spacing of aircraft, in the time lost before guns ever fired. By early November, the pressure around Achmer and the nearby fields had narrowed further. The German side still had bases, but it had less usable sky above them. Every recovery demanded fuel, altitude, and a clear circuit at almost the same moment. American escort timing had already made that difficult. What changed now was that the difficulty became routine. Pilots returning from the bomber stream had to think not only about damage and fuel state, but about whether fighters would be waiting over the approach. That took away defensive depth. The Me-262 remained fastest in level flight. Over its own airfields, it no longer owned the vertical room needed to turn speed into safety. The 8th of November, 1944. The 8th Air Force sent heavy bombers into Germany again, with escort fighters spread not just beside the formations, but across the routes that mattered to the German return. Kommando Nowotny launched to intercept. The German side still got aircraft into the air. That much remained. What it did not keep was choice. To reach the bombers, the jets had to climb through an air picture already layered against them. To return, they had to descend through the same one. The loss here was reach. A commander could still order an interception. He could no longer order a clean withdrawal, simply because the attack had ended. That day, the arithmetic of the mission compressed hard. A jet sortie no longer ran from takeoff to attack. It ran from takeoff to recovery, with American fighters sitting inside the final portion of the line. The Germans could still launch. Some sorties still reached the bomber stream. Others aborted, turned back, or came home under pressure that left no clean margin for a second try. The exact count mattered less than the pattern. Mission planning had become an exercise in acceptable damage to force structure. Aircraft committed to one interception risked loss not at the bomber box, but on the route back to base, where every return used known geography and narrowing fuel. That procedural fear entered the paperwork before it entered legend. Operations had to be timed around expected bomber approach, expected escort persistence, expected landing windows, expected gaps that were no longer reliable. The Germans were now spending experienced pilots to keep a demonstration alive. That was the deepest subtraction of all. A new force can absorb confusion. It cannot absorb the steady loss of the few men meant to teach it how to fight. With every pressured recovery, Kommando Nowotny lost not just machines or sorties, but competence in the making. By the afternoon over Achmer, the faster aircraft had been boxed into less maneuvering room than the enemy stalking it. That was the point the German side had been trying not to name. We are flying into a net on the way home. The number attached to that realization was the 7th of October, 1944. After that date, the interception of jets by escort fighters was no longer exceptional, and the road back to Achmer led into a system, not an accident. In the operations rooms of the Reich defense, the answer to the open anomaly was not hidden in the Me-262 at all. It was hidden in the American ability to make contact recur. The escort system of the 8th Air Force did not need one perfect chase. It needed layered fighters that could stay with the bombers, range ahead of them, and then shift over the bases and recovery lanes the jets had to use. That was why the figure from early October would not close for the Germans. A single success by a jet in the attack did not cancel an American presence that returned the next mission and the mission after that. The method was repeatable because the Americans were organizing time and position, not waiting for chance. For the German side, that mattered more than raw speed. A Me-262 could choose the instant of its firing pass. It could not choose its airfield. It could not choose an unlimited climb. It could not choose to recover somewhere outside the escort net. Once the Americans learned to place fighters over likely approaches and withdrawal lines, every German adjustment became partial. A changed launch rhythm solved one problem and opened another. Earlier takeoffs exposed aircraft in climb. Later takeoffs shortened the attack window. Wider dispersal complicated assembly. Tighter concentration invited detection. The Germans still had options. They no longer had restoring options. That is why their response never looked irrational from inside the cockpit or the staff room. They shortened procedures where they could. They kept scramble routines urgent. They relied on fast, direct attacks against the bomber stream, because the attack itself was still the one phase where the jet could impose terms. They also kept committing the formation under Nowotny's name, because to stop committing it would have admitted that the weapon had not yet created a workable air defense. The command was not blinded, it was cornered. Every adjustment was an effort to preserve the only remaining margin, and every effort spent the very force needed to sustain it. The American machine behind that cornering was not one squadron waiting at one field. It was a system able to keep pressure across distance and duration. Fighter cover beside the heavy bombers was only the visible layer. Above and beyond the stream, escorts could be where German jets had to climb, where they had to turn back, and where they had to descend. The Germans felt the result as a loss of sequence. Interception, disengagement, and landing no longer happened in separate compartments. The Americans had fused them. That fusion explains why German countermeasures did not restore control. The Me-262 still gave brief tactical advantage in the attack. American coordination denied operational freedom before and after the attack. The more the Germans depended on narrow, carefully timed windows, the more a persistent escort system punished delay, damage, low fuel, or a forced reroute. In that sense, the crisis of Kommando Nowotny was not simply attrition. It was institutional immaturity under a mature enemy method. The formation had been thrown into combat before doctrine, field routine, and pilot replacement could absorb repeated interference at every stage of a sortie. So desperation began to take a measurable form. The Germans launched operations with too little margin in altitude, fuel, and recovery space because the alternative was not better preparation. The alternative was to leave the bombers unanswered. Under those conditions, even a successful pass could produce a failed mission if the aircraft came back damaged, scattered, or pursued into the circuit. The unit was no longer proving the jet. It was trying to keep the proving effort alive under conditions that prevented maturation. The point was not yet death, but breakage. A command built as an emergency bridge was being used as if it were a settled weapon arm, while the Americans treated every return route as part of the combat zone. Galland's preference for continued use could not change that arithmetic. Nor could reputation. We can still reach them in the stream. We cannot clear the way back. The hard number was the 8th of November 1944. On that date, the system that had kept the pressure repeatable met the man chosen to give the jet its credibility. Over northwestern Germany that afternoon, the last approach to disaster still looked like routine work. The bombers were in, the escorts were out, and the air over Achmer was no longer separate from the battle farther east. For the Germans, the sequence was familiar enough to be dangerous. Scramble, climb, reach the stream, fire if the chance came, turn home before fuel, and timing closed the circuit. What had changed by then was invisible from the cockpit until the return began. The route back had become the place where the enemy had prepared to be. Major Walter Nowotny went up as commander of Kommando Nowotny and as the one name the Luftwaffe had attached to the Me-262 in combat. Around him was not a mature jet arm, but a formation still being blooded in the defense of the Reich. The aircraft still gave him speed. It still gave him heavy forward fire. It did not give him a private sky over his own base. By the time he turned back toward the Achmer area, American fighters were already in the airspace that mattered most, the descent and recovery lanes where a jet had to trade altitude and speed for a runway. The controversy over the exact shooter has never altered the shape of the event. Captain Ernest C. Fabelkorn has been credited in that contested final encounter, and other American pilots were tied to the engagement as well. The American face of the moment remains a fighter formation, not a duel. Escort fighters from the 8th Air Force were in position over the recovery route. That is the fixed point. The Germans did not meet a lone pursuer arriving by luck. They met an organized presence already where the jet had to come down. Nowotny's final minutes unfolded inside that trap. His Me-262 had to return through a shrinking margin of altitude, fuel, and approach space. In level flight, the aircraft was still faster than the piston fighters hunting it. In recovery, it had fewer choices. It had to descend. It had to align for base. It had to pass through air the Americans could search and hold. Whatever damage, mechanical trouble, or immediate tactical pressure accompanied the last encounter, the larger fact stood